Victoria 3's Pivot of Empire DLC, which centers on India, has just come out, alongside the affectionately named Racism patch. This is my review for it, but it's a little different from other reviews on the channel. Normally I script out and highly organize my reviews, but for this one, I just wasn't pulled in enough by the DLC to want to make a full Victoria 3 oriented script. That's not necessarily to throw shade at the DLC or patch, it's more that I'm on a big Victoria 3 burnout cycle right now, and the DLC and patch weren't so amazing that they would rip me out of that burnout. This section of the video is scripted, since intros are important, but the rest of the video past this point is going to be off the cuff. I had some notes on my screen to help guide my thoughts and keep me on track, but essentially, this video is the distillation of my thoughts on the Pivot of Empire DLC and patch. I hope you enjoy, and I hope it helps you decide if you want to purchase it or not. Okay, so Victoria 3 Pivot of Empire is the newest Victoria 3 DLC, coming with a very important free patch. The DLC itself is pretty mid, is what I would say, and that's not necessarily really a bad thing. In case you can't tell, I'm making this review off the cuff, just because I realized that I didn't end up writing a review out because I wasn't that interested in this DLC. I'll just be honest with you, when I was playing it, I didn't really care all that much for it. So as a result, I kind of skimmed through it, and that's my bad as a reviewer, obviously, which is why I decided to delay the review just to kind of let other people tell me a little bit more about the DLC. I talked to Journalist Gaming, I talked with other YouTubers like Chum and Smithy and a couple people just to get an idea of like what's the finger on the pulse looking like here. When I played Pivot of Empire, I was pretty excited more so for the free features. The India content, even though I am a bit of an India file, you could say, it was interesting to me, but when I dropped in as a Sick Empire, I discovered that they basically only have like one journal entry and that's all they get. And that's a bit lame for me, but I understand the Sick Empire is not really the highlight of the patch. It's more like it's the East India Company. It's totally fair. East India Company has quite a few like routes it can take, and I like that. I like that there's different ways to play them. You can kind of stay loyal to the British. You can break free right away and splinter into a million princely states. You can try to stay loyal for a bit, put down the princes, and then go free. There's a couple different things you can do, and there's a couple of journal entries. I just find that my honest take about it is that it's not a good enough DLC to pull me back into the game after being a little bit burnt out on it. One major thing that the game adds via the DLC is the caste system, which I found was pretty inconsequential to the game. I found that there was never really a purpose to ever elevate the power of the castes, except maybe for roleplay, because the benefit of having a more enforced caste system is that minimum acceptance threshold that comes on for the Brahmin caste, but the Brahmin caste already has that minimum threshold when you have the unenforced castes. The only way you can get rid of that is if you were to go to the affirmative action option, which comes much later in the game. You're only really harming your population by enforcing the caste system, which, to be fair, it's a pretty good representation of reality, if you ask me. But I would have liked some kind of reason to put the caste system in, because it begs the question of why the British did it. Some people told me the idea that maybe you want to put the caste system in as Britain so that you can weaken your subjects by having them be weaker. That's a fair idea. I just find that, you know, that there really should be some kind of benefit to it, because otherwise it just feels really pointless. It feels like, okay, so this exists only because the AI wants to throw it onto me, but the AI will never throw it onto me because the AI doesn't think that way. Only a player would consider looking at the EIC and then saying, yeah, let's enforce the caste system more harshly to harm the EIC so it can't mess with me more. Because in reality, we all know that what we actually want is more stable subjects. We'd actually prefer they get a little bit stronger and maybe not have all this discrimination so that they don't get rebellions and get revolutions that are going to cause problems, especially with the EIC, where if they get a revolution, it can be pretty disastrous. So I found the caste system to be underwhelming. I do like what it gives as an idea. The idea that every job can have different modifiers applied to it. So castes are determined in the game by the profession, right? Which is sort of similar to casteism in India, although sometimes it can also be genetic in real life. It can be inherited, but it's mostly a job-based thing. That's fair. The ability to distinguish jobs by more than just low class, middle class, upper class is cool. And I hope that one day that system gets expanded on more, because that would be really cool. But regardless, castes definitely were a very boring system as far as I was concerned. That's the DLC. There's not really a whole lot to say about it. It's a very small DLC. I wasn't expecting a ton out of it. It's sort of like the Brazil DLC, but I find it to be a little bit weaker. I think Brazil's content was a little more interesting, but this is all just a matter of, personal flavor, I guess. It's not really that important. What really matters is the free patch that came with it, which is a lot more important as far as I'm concerned. This is the often touted racism patch, which is a funny name for it. The thing about it is that the racism that it adds isn't really much of a game changer. So the big thing is that now, when you play an ethno-state or national supremacy or something like that, there's actually a reason to do it. And the big reason is that you can actually add wages to your pops based on their acceptance level. Different laws affect how much the wage discrepancy is between different levels of tolerance. And that, to me, is a very good change. The patch is probably one of the better patches. Like, it's a bigger patch than I would say other patches have been lately, but it's not huge. It's not like the world-shattering society builder update I was kind of thinking it might have ended up being, because when we first heard about the racism update, I was thinking that it would really alter the way that we play the game. Like, we would pay a lot more attention to the exact composition of the population of our country. But if we're being honest here, it's more or less the same gameplay. Basically, multiculturalism ends up winning out, but it's hard to acquire. Ethnostate is less of a funny meme and a little more of a particular build. So if you're playing something like Japan or Germany, and conveniently these line up with historically ethnostate-like countries, but those kind of countries are going to do really well on ethnostate, simply because you have all these pops who are your primary culture, and therefore they can get higher wages, you can get more authority, and you can basically give a lot of benefits to those pops while putting down all your other pops. It makes complete sense, and I think it's a good system. I did a couple playthroughs where I played as like the United States. I went like fascist ethnostate United States, I went multicultural United States. I found that ultimately the gameplay loop is still the same. So no matter who you're playing as, you're still going to be making buildings the same way. You're still going to be planning your economy the same way. You're still going to be wanting mass migrations, because even in an ethnostate, a mass migration of distolerated pops at least makes for lower wages for your businesses. I was talking with a journalist one time about the power of like depressing wages through discrimination. And it can be good because it means more profits on the industries, right? Now, I tend to play for SOL more so than for GDP, whereas Generalist plays a lot more for GDP. So we have the differing view on that, which is totally fine. And if anything, I'm happy about that. I am very glad to see differing views, because so often me and the other Victoria 3 gamers, you might say, Victoria 3 content creators, will more or less just come to an agreement about what exactly is good and what exactly is bad. In this case, there's finally some level of different takes. It used to be the case that, for example, laissez-faire was just always the correct option, and it still mostly is just the correct option because of all the free money modifiers. But I remember when the new ownership system came in, there was arguments for interventionism because of the government dividends and because of the immunity to foreigners buying up your industries. That was pretty cool. In this case, we've gotten now a similar idea with the tolerances. Depending on what country you play and how many mass migrations you've had, it will either be better to go multiculturalism or it'll be better to go with ethnostate, which is nice. Beyond that, the political movement system has changed drastically. I like the change quite a bit. I feel like it's a little bit toothless at times, though, and it's very easy to circumvent. So political movements now, rather than being a look to change one law and which are supported by a interest group, a political movement will instead be this kind of ever-present thing that exists in your country, where it has a core ideology, such as, let's say, modernization, which will want interventionism and protectionism and this kind of stuff. And that movement will then apply pressure based on its power to the interest groups. It gains power from pops wanting to support it, and pops support it based on their job and situations like their discrimination level or what their wages are like or their SOL, things like that. It's got a similar problem to the general interest group support system broadly, which is that you end up with pops whose entire ideological basis is defined by their job, which, I've talked at length about the Marxist inspirations for the game, which, as I said before, I'm not putting as an insult. It's just that it can be a little bit, to me anyway, it can be a little bit too narrow sometimes to just look at things from a job perspective. But I will say that by adding modifiers for discrimination to change what political movements a pop will pick, that does add a little more to the pie, you could say. Previously that was the case as well, but it was such a tiny modifier that, for example, your laborers will always support the trade unions, even if they're a upper class culture. Like, let's say you had ethnostate and you had like a German cultural hegemony. Well, for whatever reason, those laborers who are enjoying the peak of life under an ethno-state will still, want to head towards multiculturalism under an anarchist trade union because all laborers always supported the trade unions. So it was like, okay, that was kind of weird. There should be some difference. And now that there's this discrimination stuff in, for example, movements that are like supremacist movements will tend to be composed of pops that are the primary culture, which means that you're not going to have trade union laborers who will actively fight against their own interests. You're going to have laborers who are going to see that they are benefiting from being the primary culture, and they will then espouse, beliefs in that, which again is super cool. This expands into the way that revolutions work. So a revolution now, when it fires, sometimes is a secession, and I love that. Previously, the only secessionist revolution that would pop up is the CSA. So when the Americans have their civil war over slavery, you get the secession in the South. But now, any country can have a political movement that will try to rise up and secede. And I like that a lot. It creates an interesting situation where, first of all, you get dynamic tags, and that's always wonderful to see. You might see a separatist New York, for example, then that separatism leads to its own country called New York, and it has a uniquely generated flag, and that's great. Most often, you'll see the separatist movements are anarchists, and that again makes a lot of sense. Anarchists love to separate, I would imagine, and the AI is not very good at handling it. So you'll see quite a few anarchist tags, but another big detail here is that when you have a revolution, in the previous patches of the game, every revolution for every law would pit you against like half your country, and it was pretty tough to put down in almost every case. In this new system, sometimes you'll get a revolution, and it'll be composed of like 1 or 2 states, and their cause is completely lost. They have no chance of winning, but they try anyway, and I like that a lot because it means that your country isn't this perfectly stable entity, even if you do a good job of running it. For example, if you play the United States and you conquer Beijing, which is a common strategy for the United States in the current meta of the game, you may find yourself dealing with some Han separatists. And those Han separatists, even if they're completely doomed because they have no chance of winning with just the state of Beijing, they will rise up anyway, and you'll have to deal with them. It gives you a sense that your imperialism has consequences, and I've always loved that, because we do live in the world of Victoria 3, where the colonies will often have a higher standard of living than the homeland, just because there's less population there, which is hilarious to me. But they've kind of fixed that now, because you will see that the people living in those colonies are going to want their freedom, which is nice. I complained about it in my review video a while back, where I said that no one in the game cares about anything except for their standard of living. Well, not anymore. Pops now are ideologically motivated, and I love that. It's funny I'm saying all this because on my stream, just when the game came out on my stream, I mentioned how I didn't like the DLC very much, and that's true. I don't like the DLC very much. This happens a lot with Victoria 3 these days, where the DLC sucks and then the patch is really good. This patch is honestly better than I first thought it was. I think when I first played it, I was still kind of in a bit of a Victoria 3 burnout phase. I like a lot of the ideas that are coming here. The problem is that some of the executions aren't really so good. Like, the political movements tend to be toothless, unfortunately, but that was also what happened when I played on the early access patch. Since the early access patch, they've added in a activism floor for when you're passing a law against a movement. So, for example, it was previously the case that it was very rare that a movement would gain activism enough to actually influence the country unless you were actively passing a law that was against that movement's interests. Now, if you have certain laws, the floor of activism will come in, which is great. I think that's a really smart idea. So if you have like a supremacist movement and you're on multiculturalism, the base level activism on that movement is going to be a little bit high. I don't remember what it will be, but I think it's 25% or something, which is enough to influence the country. That's great. I also had the issue where secret police kind of just ruined the game. Not completely. Like, secret police have always been a little bit overpowered, but with secret police, you can cut down the activism on all your political movements by 50%. And that's not multiplicative, that's additive. I thought it was multiplicative at first, then I realized it was additive, and I realized that that was crazy, because cutting it down to 50 means that you'll probably never get a revolution ever again. I'm hoping that will be changed to be multiplicative eventually, which would still be very strong, but not quite that just absolutely dominant level of power. But we'll see. In terms of other changes, the one that I'm the least happy about is the company change. So I love the idea. This happens a lot with Paradox games, is the idea is good and the execution isn't so good. The companies are now pretty weak, unfortunately. Previously, companies provided a sense of specialization to your economy. So it was like, I'm going to focus on making steel this run, which, to be fair, every country wants to do that. So there was a bit of railroading in that sense. You almost always went with the iron mine company, the coal mine company, the steel company, etc. But regardless, now the companies operate autonomously, which makes a lot more sense, and I like that. But they don't operate very intelligently. I made a post about this in the Early Access Discord where I talked about the unfortunate occurrence where the math works out with the throughput bonus that a company will almost always prefer to build a level 1 building that's not been built anywhere rather than building up a large building in one spot. So take a look at this screenshot here. You can see that there's level 1 logging camps across the whole market and then just a handful of larger logging camps here and there. This is because the throughput bonus is so massive that when the company's deciding where to invest, it will look at the highest profit it can get, which is reasonable, of course, I expect nothing less, but it won't account for anything long term. They think very short term. They think, well, I could try to buy up, for example, let's say 12 levels of government owned buildings in one logging camp in order to get my massive throughput bonus on a larger building, which is better. Or I can build level 1 logging camp here, level 1 logging camp there, level 1 logging camp over there, and each of those will have like 70% throughput, which means a great profit, right? That's true, but it's not as satisfying. So even though, in theory, the AI is actually playing correctly here by choosing to build up just level 1 logging camps that have high throughput, the moment that any financial district, or even the player, chooses to build with that company, they are now cutting the throughput bonus in like half, which is crazy. This makes a weird incentive where you as the player don't want to build the buildings that you have founded a company for. That doesn't feel very intuitive, doesn't feel very satisfying, it just feels kind of weird. It feels like before, you picked companies based on your specialization, now you pick companies based on what you don't want to build, which is just really strange. I think you'll see people complaining about that in the future as well. Also, the way that companies are allotted ability to build is basically that they get a dice roll based on how much of the share of reinvestment is their share. This means they will always be outcompeted by financial districts, and by the player even, because if you have laissez-faire, remember, your government dividends go straight into reinvestment. So if you have some very profitable opium plantation, for example, that plantation is just going to completely outcompete your company and it'll never be able to get very many levels. This is an unfortunate thing where balance is kind of the issue. I think that over time, probably this will be changed in some way so that the balance is better. But for right now, it's just kind of, it doesn't feel good. It results in you having many buildings across many states that will all have 5% bonus, 6% bonus, maybe 10%, from their company. When I think most people are looking for more like they want to have their big mega building. I showed the comparison in that same post on the Early Access Discord where I mentioned that one of these is more satisfying than the other. Check out the Sindh opium plantation with like 250,000 profits and 111% throughput. This is a crazy building, right? That is very nice to see. Compare that to the 1 or 2, or maybe it's more like 5 or 6% throughput bonus on all these logging camps. It may be true even that the logging camps having a small spread of company ownership throughout them is actually better in a way than the one stacked up logging camp. And yet somehow one of them is just less fun. Sometimes fun comes before analysis. I mentioned that analytical players like me and generalists, we're going to have a problem where our optimal builds are going to feel really weird to pull off and you're going to have to play kind of counterintuitively. And then for the non-analytical players, they're going to see like a 5 to 10% increase on throughput and just not really care for it very much. They're not going to feel satisfied. Whereas before, when you made a company, it was really satisfying to look at the building speed bonus, to look at the throughput bonus on all the buildings. That was something that I think many players were always looking forward to see. But I totally forgot to even talk about harvest conditions. I didn't have them in my notes or anything. They're not really that interesting to me. They provide a little bit of dynamism, I guess, to the game, but it's not like they're making decisions, right? So one important factor for any strategy game, this is just basic design if you ask me, is that in a strategy game, decisions are really important. The decision to do this or do that. In Victoria 3, those decisions are things like what laws to pass, what buildings to make, what trade routes to have, what countries to ally with or to rival, and so on. But, these harvest conditions kind of just happen to you. And it's very rare that you would end up changing anything about your playthrough based on a harvest condition. They're more like little RNG bumps, I guess. It's sort of like, well, maybe you get lucky and get a boost to your country. Maybe you get unlucky and get a negative. I mean, it's not going to change the way you play the game. That's about all I have to say about harvest conditions. I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's good that it's there. I think it's good for roleplay. That's one thing I can always say about these sort of mechanics that aren't that interesting, that are kind of just there, is that, yeah, if I'm ever writing a script or something for like a story video, it could be cool to mention like the forest fire that caused a great poverty in one area, or the flood that resulted in a lot of death. You know, this kind of thing is something, at least. It's positive. The point of all this is that this DLC and this patch is overall a positive for the game. It's just that it's not a huge addition to the game or anything. Regardless, that's pretty much all my thoughts about the DLC. This video isn't super long, so sorry for that. If you want a review score, I mean, you know, review scores are pretty arbitrary, but this DLC, for me, is like a 4 out of 10, okay? But that's not to say that the patch isn't good. Just rating the DLC on its own, it's not very good if you ask me. That's just my thoughts, though. I think it's going to be better received by others. Other people are going to like it more than I will. I have an inherent bias against journals. I don't like flavor, I prefer systems. That's just how I am. Okay. In terms of the patch is not bad. The patch is not bad at all. For me, solid like 7 to 8. It's hard to say exactly. I go back and forth. Sometimes I feel like, yeah, this is like an 8 out of 10 patch. Not bad at all. Other times I feel like it's not really as impactful as I would have wanted it to be. The unfortunate reality is that because I played in early access and then things changed, a lot of my perceptions are a bit different. So for example, one issue that I really hated was that in the early access patch, if you were below tolerance level 3, which is open prejudice, then the pops of that type could not work in military buildings. So basically, the ethno-state couldn't send its culturally erased, you know, minorities that it hates off to die in war. And I'm not saying that, you know, that sounds really sus, like, oh yeah, I want to send the minorities to go die or something. I don't mean it like that. I mean it more like I would have liked that thematic essence of the ethno-state, of like the protected upper class and the weaker lower class. That wasn't really as present. Even though it was present, it didn't feel as good. Now you can create a military composed of the lower classes of pop who go and die for the wars to support the upper classes, and I like that a lot. It's a small change, but it was important to me. The same thing was happening with government buildings. So now only the very lowest level of pops can't work in government buildings unless you have multiculturalism, but with multiculturalism, no pop will be at the lowest level, so it doesn't matter. But I like the system because of how it changes imperialism as well. It's not reasonable now to conquer Beijing and then incorporate it because you can't get any government workers in there. Regardless, I'm kind of going on and on. Overall, DLC plus patch, I'm going to say like solid 7.5 out of 10. It's not enough to pull me out of kind of Victoria 3 retirement, so to speak, but it is enough that I would say it's a good addition to the game, puts it on a good path. It's just that you're going to need more to get me unburnt out. I'm totally burnt out on Victoria 3, so don't expect any content. I'm making this review sort of out of a formality, because I like to make reviews for the new stuff. But I don't really want to make content. It's not enough to make me want to come back. That could change, though. It's totally possible that I'll have a random spark of just wanting to play the game, and then I'll get addicted again. We'll see. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the review. Sorry for the lack of script. I didn't end up writing a script like I mentioned earlier in the video because I wasn't that interested in the DLC. But I hope this is at least something that'll help inform your purchase. Thank you for your time.